Okay. Okay, hello and welcome. Today's session is focused on Indigenous cultural safety in practice and what that means, why it matters, and how it shows up in our day-to-day work with patients. So this can be complex and sometimes uncomfortable topic, and that's okay. The goal isn't to have all the answers, but to build awareness, reflect on our practice, and leave with some practical tools we can apply. So we'll start with a land acknowledgement. We're gathering today on the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples of Treaty 7 and the Métis Nation. We respect the cultures, languages, and histories of all First Peoples of Canada and are grateful for their presence, which enriches our community. And for me, land acknowledgement is a little pause and reflection about the past, present, and future. It's about what I'm doing and will do to honor my ancestors and generations after me. We're still here. We're raising families, creating art, going to school, hunting, and harvesting. And it's not about guilt, it's about responsibility. It's a commitment to learn the real history of this land and its people and to do better moving forward. So if you live or work in Treaty 7, that responsibility belongs to you because we're all treaty people. So I encourage you to create your own land acknowledgement and have it change and evolve with you. Practice saying the names of local nations because it matters, and make it personal and make it relevant to your life and your work. So hello, welcome. My name is Beth Finn, and I'm one of the Indigenous liaisons here at the Primary Care Network Calgary Zone. I'm a member of Buffalo Lake Métis Settlement, but I grew up in Calgary, and my background is in social work.
Yes, and I'm Veronica Big Plume. I am from both Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territories. I am a member of the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and my background is an interdisciplinary background with a focus on higher education and leadership.
Okay. So the purpose of this training is to build a strong emotional foundation for Indigenous patient care. So it's about understanding why cultural safety is necessary, begin reflecting on behaviors, and confronting the reality of healthcare in Canada. And everything you'll learn today is grounded in real issues Indigenous patients face in healthcare systems right now. So I did start my own smudge just to begin in a good way. And everyone can take a breath and take a moment to quiet your mind and set your intentions. So, in part one today, we'll start by just reviewing some key Indigenous terminology, followed by an introduction to UNDRIP and the TRC. And we'll also explore how healthcare systems were built and what that means for Indigenous patients today, and provide an overview of programs like Jordan's Principle and non-insured health benefits. So I'll pass it over to Veronica, who will walk us through some common Indigenous terminology.
Yes, going over Indigenous terminology. Here are some common terms you may come across in your work. Having a basic understanding of them can help you feel more confident and respectful in your interactions with patients. Indigenous is the blanket term for the first peoples of this land, and it includes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Status Indian refers to First Nations people who are registered under the Indian Act and have official recognition by the federal government. Legal identity, not cultural identity. Elder is a respected title earned through lived experience, wisdom, and community trust. Age or gender are not factors. Elders carry deep knowledge and are approached with care and proper protocol. We also have knowledge keeper, which often refers to an expert in the traditional knowledge, ceremony, and cultural teachings. More informal, but still valued and respected. Traditional medicines could include sage, sweetgrass, cedar, tobacco, and it's all used for healing, ceremony, and spiritual connection. Ceremony is important for an individual's healing and renewal journey. It could include sweat lodge, pipe ceremony, and sundance. We also have sharing circle, which is a safe and respectful, judgment-free space where participants speak openly, often guided by an elder or knowledge keeper. It's used for healing, decision-making, and community building. Relationality. Indigenous worldviews centered on in relationships with people, the land, ancestors, and the spirit world. We are all related and connected. Last but not least, we have reciprocity, a strong cultural value of mutual respect and balance in giving and receiving. It fosters empathy and interdependence. So now that we've grounded ourselves in some respectful and community used terms, Beth will be going over some outdated language to be aware of.
Okay. So language evolves, and respectful care means being open to learning, asking, and adapting. So we're going to go over some common outdated terms, their origins, and why they could be harmful. So a few kind of colonial terms are Aboriginal, which was replaced in the Constitution by Indigenous. Indian is only really used in the legal context, like the Indian Act or Status Indian. And this one comes from the 1500s when Christopher Columbus mistook Canada for Asia. And then Eskimo is not really a term that the Inuit used to describe themselves. It was given to them by outsiders. And then some of the slurs are half breed. It's used to invalidate Métis identity as a distinct nation with rich history, culture, and language. And then squaw is an Algonquin word meaning woman, but it's both racist and misogynistic. It's been used as a sexual slur to subjugate Indigenous women. And then savage was used to describe the Indians as unrefined and uncultured and used to dehumanize and justify colonization. And then some more casual kind of misuse is the word powwow. Some people use that as like a meeting. Let's have a little powwow and just kind of disregards the ceremony. And then a few other ones are my tribe or spirit animal. I hear this used in social media a lot, and it just kind of is infantilizing and devaluing spiritual connection to animals and ancestors. So, understanding outdated terminology helps us recognize the history behind the language, avoid causing harm, and build more respectful, culturally safe relationships with our patients. So, if we zoom out for a moment, Veronica will go into some important frameworks to be aware of and how they guide our work.
Yes, so going over two important key frameworks related to healthcare and what we at the PCN are doing to align with them. You may be familiar with UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's an international framework that affirms Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, land, culture, language, and traditional practices. It received royal assent in Canada on June 2021. It sets a global standard for how institutions like ours should respect and uphold Indigenous rights, especially given the harms of the past. The articles highlighted above affirms that Indigenous peoples have the right to access healthcare without discrimination while also maintaining their traditional healing practices, and that health is closely tied to broader social conditions like housing, income, and access to services. It also emphasizes self-determination, meaning Indigenous communities have the right to design and control their own health programs, and requires meaningful consultation and consent for decisions that impact their health and well-being. Next, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. Think of them as a national to-do list guiding governments, schools, healthcare, and other systems that repair relationships and promote equity for Indigenous peoples. In healthcare, the calls to action are especially important. They recognize how colonialism, systemic racism, and intergenerational trauma have created deep health inequities. Understanding this reminds us that health outcomes aren't just individual, they're shaped by systems, and we have a responsibility to change those systems. Some examples of what we are doing that aligns these directives and frameworks. So this training, our Indigenous liaison roles, community partnerships that include the Elbow River Healing Lodge, our G4 Health, 6 Health Services, a smudge space at CFPCN, and access to medicines, the newly formed Elders Council, the Truth and Reconciliation Steering Committee, and adjusting our hiring practices. These are all directly aligned. Understanding UNDRIP and TRC calls to action helps us align our work with national and global standards and ensures Indigenous patients are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Another important document that is worth taking a read through is the Yellowhead Institute's 10-year review on the calls to action. This report is a critical assessment of Canada's progress since the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It notes that after 10 years, we have only implemented 13 out of 94 calls to action. Even with these frameworks in place, many Indigenous peoples continue to experience barriers in healthcare. To understand why, we need to look at how power and privilege operate within the system. Beth will talk about the next slide.
Okay, so power and privilege in healthcare are about how systems, policies, and everyday actions give certain groups advantages while leaving others behind. In Canada, this plays out clearly for Indigenous peoples. Power and privilege shape who gets access to care, the quality of that care, how patients are treated, and the health outcomes they experience. So these imbalances are not accidental, they're rooted in colonialism. So why is that important? Understanding power dynamics helps us reflect on where we hold privilege and where others may not, and then how that shows up in the experiences of Indigenous patients. So power is the authority healthcare providers and systems hold to make decisions, control access, and influence care. So in decision making, healthcare systems have historically been designed without Indigenous voices, perspectives, or leadership at the table. In resources and navigation, systems can be complex and difficult to navigate, so patients may not know what supports exist or may feel overwhelmed trying to access them. In representation, there's still a lack of Indigenous healthcare staff and leadership, which means Indigenous perspectives and values are often missing in care planning. And then trust. So experiences of harm, both historical and ongoing, have led to deep mistrust of the healthcare system for many Indigenous patients. And then there's also jurisdiction and geography. So many Indigenous patients face barriers related to living in remote communities or navigating gaps between the federal and provincial systems. So privilege refers to the advantages that shape whose voices are heard, believed, and prioritized within the healthcare system. So access to care, the ability to access timely, appropriate, and culturally safe care is not experienced equally. Trust in provider, so feeling respected, safe, and understood directly impacts whether patients return for care. Cultural validation, so Western biomedical approaches are often prioritized, while Indigenous knowledge and healing practices may be dismissed or overlooked. Social determinants of health like housing, food security, and access to clean water play a significant role in health outcomes. And then self-advocacy. So patients are often expected to navigate complex systems and advocate for themselves, which can be difficult due to barriers like past trauma, language, or fear of not being taken seriously. So we've talked about the barriers Indigenous patients can face, but it's just as important to know what supports exist to help address some of those gaps. And Veronica will be going into some of those specific benefit programs that many Indigenous patients are eligible for.
Yes, going over the benefits. As an Indigenous liaison, we often receive questions from clinicians who want to know what benefits exist that they can utilize to support their patients. This is an important question because not all Indigenous peoples are eligible for certain benefits and services through the federal programs. We're going to give you a brief overview of the three main programs you should be aware of. However, we would highly encourage everyone to consider which programs are relevant to their specific roles and learn more about these programs in greater detail. For example, as a pharmacist, you may want to learn about what medication coverage is available through NIHB, or as a physiotherapist, you may want to learn more about medical equipment that can be funded through NIHB or Jordan's Principle. We'll start with the non-insured health benefit, or NIHB. NIHB is only available to First Nations who are registered under the Indian Act and Inuit who are recognized by an Inuit land claim organization. NIHB provides coverage for a range of health benefits, including pharmacy, vision, dental, counseling, medical supplies or equipment, and medical transportation. Jordan's Principle, we're going to share a bit more about the history of Jordan's Principle in just a moment, but let's talk about Jordan's Principle for now as a source of funding. Jordan's Principle provides funding for services including mental health services, speech and physical therapy, dental care, medical equipment, and education supports for First Nations children who might otherwise experience a gap or delay in those services. It is available to children registered or eligible to be registered under the Indian Act, or who have one parent registered or eligible to be registered, recognized by their nation for the purposes of Jordan's Principle, or ordinarily a resident on reserve. And lastly, we wanted to mention that specifically here in Alberta, the Oti-Bimisiwak Métis government, also known as the Métis Nation within Alberta, the MNA, does provide some funding services to MNA citizens, including for mental health, dental care, cancer support, and addiction services. However, these services are only available to registered MNA citizens.
Okay. So moving on to part 2, we'll explore the current state of healthcare, including experiences of racism within the system. And we'll look at case studies with local examples and examine the social determinants of health and use a patient journey map to bring all these concepts together. So racism in healthcare can show up in different ways, not just in individual reactions, but across the entire system. And currently, 1 in 5 Indigenous people report experiencing discrimination in healthcare. So systemic racism refers to how the structures, rules, and norms of society create an unequal distribution of power, resources, and opportunities. So in healthcare, this shows up as barriers in access, bias in care, and systems that don't reflect or support Indigenous patients. Institutional racism happens within the policies and daily operations of organizations. So when systems ignore cultural context or patient history, often unintentionally, it leads to harmful outcomes. Interpersonal racism happens on the front line, so microaggressions, stereotypes, and harmful assumptions from individual providers. And this is where we lose patients, and that's where we need to hold our colleagues accountable. So when care providers let their biases influence treatment, it erodes trust, worsens health outcomes, and reinforces feelings of exclusion. So colonialism dismantled Indigenous health systems and dismissed traditional healing, and that still lingers today with epistemic racism, as Indigenous knowledge is left out of medical models. So what are the impacts of that? Over 25% of Indigenous people wait more than 2 weeks for non-urgent care. Many delay or avoid care altogether due to discrimination, leading to worsened health outcomes. Hidden biases, also like assuming Indigenous patients are neglectful parents, drug seeking, or frequent flyers, fuel this avoidance and erode care quality. And these barriers contribute to an 18.2-year gap in life expectancy between Indigenous and non Indigenous populations. So, alongside patient experiences, research is also helping us understand how bias shows up on the provider side. And in the next slide, Veronica will be highlighting an interesting case study.
Yes. So in 2023, there was a study on the prevalence and characteristics of anti-Indigenous bias among Alberta physicians. Pamela Roach, a local Métis research professor, she was our last year's panel member as well. The research aimed to measure both explicit and implicit bias among Alberta doctors and to better understand how these biases might affect patient care. In Indigenous health, explicit bias shows up as overt racism or discriminatory actions, while implicit bias operates more subtly through unconscious assumptions that influence how care is delivered. Most existing research focused on patient experiences of racism, not healthcare providers' attitudes. The study was anonymous and voluntary, which was critical to gathering truthful data and reducing the risk of social desirability bias. That is the tendency to give acceptable rather than honest answers. This study was necessary because Indigenous peoples in Canada continue to experience racism and discrimination in healthcare settings, which contribute to significant health disparities and mistrust in the medical system. Out of 375 responding physicians, 8.3%, that is 32 out of 375, reported feeling unfavorably toward Indigenous peoples. When asked to express a preference between white people and Indigenous peoples, 25%, 32 out of 128 respondents favored white people. White cisgender male physicians demonstrated the highest implicit bias, witnessed or experienced anti-Indigenous bias. Both Indigenous and non-Indigenous respondents recounted firsthand or observed instances of systemic and interpersonal racism in healthcare settings. Indigenous patient concerns aren't valued, and macroaggressions are examples. So when we look at this data, it's important to understand this isn't just about attitudes. These biases can influence clinical decisions, how seriously symptoms are taken, and how patients are treated. And sometimes those experiences result in serious harm. Next, we'll share a few examples to help ground this in real experiences.
Okay, so Jordan's principle was created after the death of 5-year-old Jordan River Anderson, who remained hospitalized and later passed away due to a funding dispute between the federal and provincial governments, despite being cleared to go home. So it ensures that First Nations children get the health services they need without delay, and that jurisdictional disputes are resolved after care is provided and not before. And just a little side note, this funding often runs out before the year is over, just showing the need for funding like this. Joyce's principle emerged following the death of Joyce Echequan in 2020. So while in a Quebec hospital, Joyce live streamed staff making racist and degrading comments toward her and later died of pulmonary edema. Coroner's report confirmed that systemic racism and prejudice were contributing factors. Staff wrongly assumed she was experiencing withdrawal and failed to provide appropriate care. So this goes back to those feelings of not feeling safe, respected, or understood in healthcare, and the cases that go unreported every year. So Veronica will now go into a local story.
Yes. So going into a local story, I want to ground us in a real story from here in Alberta. Myra Croce was a 49-year-old woman from Siksika Nation. She was a mother, a community member who sought care while experiencing severe pain. A formal human rights complaint filed by her nation raises concerns about delays in care, communication, and how her symptoms were responded to. I'm not sharing this to focus on every detail of what happened, but to help us understand how gaps in care can have very real impacts. Her story has deeply impacted her family and community, and it has also raised broader questions about how Indigenous patients experience care in our system. Some calls to action. Siksika Nation is calling for recognition of systemic racism in Alberta's healthcare, mandatory anti-racism and cultural humility training developed by First Nations, Indigenous leadership roles in healthcare governance, and improved complaint mechanisms with Indigenous oversight.
Okay.
And when we look at Myra's story, it's important to understand that it's not an isolated incident. Across Canada, similar patterns have been identified in cases like Joyce Echaquan and Brian Sinclair, and most recently, Heather Winterstein in Ontario. While every situation is different, there are common themes that continue to come up: delays in care, communication gaps, and experiences of racism or bias. This tells us that these aren't just about individual providers or one moment in time. These are patterns shaped by the systems people are navigating. And that's what today is really about: understanding those systems and our role within them. And to really understand that journey, we also need to understand the conditions shaping it and what we call the social determinants of health.
So the social determinants of health weigh more heavily on Indigenous people in Canada because colonial policies disrupted nearly every foundation of well-being, housing, income, education, clean water, food security, and access to care. Indigenous patients are not starting from the same place. So many are navigating multiple layers of disadvantage rooted in intergenerational trauma and reinforced by ongoing systemic barriers in healthcare, education, and social services. So even the basics that we take for granted, like access to clean water, aren't guaranteed. So if you cut your hand, most of us can just wash it under the tap, but in some communities, that's not an option. So when an Indigenous patient presents with a medical issue, it's never just about biology. It's about how history, policy, and social conditions have shaped their health risks and their ability to access care. So just another fun fact, as of July 11th, 2025, there are still 40 long-term boil water advisories in effect in Canada. So we're going to take a look at how these factors play out across a patient's journey through care. So this patient journey map was created to help patient-facing staff better understand the Indigenous experience within healthcare. So it breaks down different stages of care to help us see where these barriers can arise and where we have opportunities to respond differently. And what this means in practice is being able to recognize those barriers early and respond in a way that reduces burden on the patient and meeting them where they're at. So a big part of that is building trust through consistency, communication, and integrating a holistic approach to care. You'll also notice the medicine wheel represented here. It reflects a holistic understanding of health, one that includes not just physical health, but mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. It's a reminder that many Indigenous patients, wellness is about balance across all of these areas, and our care is stronger when we take that into account. So I'm just going to zoom in here. So at the top here, we have our hesitation stages and our barrier stages. So some of the hesitation stages could be unconscious bias and stereotyping, culturally unsafe healthcare, overall inadequate healthcare services, racism, distrust, and long wait times. And some of the barriers to care could be transportation, time and means, parking, financial barriers, unfamiliarity with city, family complications, childcare, health challenges, and also language. So if a patient makes it through the hesitation stage and initial barrier stage, we move on to intake. So having visual cues of safety is really important here as well. So making sure clinics have land acknowledgements or welcome signs in different languages. Frontline staff are flexible with appointment times if a patient is 10 minutes late, making an effort to maybe still have the appointment and just have it a little bit shorter. Prioritizing space for family members. So a lot of patients bring children, cook them, or cultural supports to appointments. So maybe booking a larger meeting room would be helpful. And also noting any language barriers. So after intake, we move over to assessment. So listening and using moments of silence are really important here. So slowing down and maybe booking a 90-minute appointment, making sure staff are understanding of those barriers and hesitations that may have come up before even making the appointment, making sure meeting spaces are inviting and culturally appropriate, also introducing yourself respectfully and explaining your role, and not making assumptions and using open-ended questions, and allowing for answers in story form as well. So that goes back to maybe booking a longer appointment time as well. Offering smudge if that's possible, adjusting your pace and being really intentional and explaining everything in detail. So moving on to referrals, so demonstrating a holistic healthcare view here, offering choice, incorporating both Western and Indigenous care when you can, ensuring a warm handoff and appropriate resources and services, and making sure that staff are knowledgeable of basic Indigenous resources, Indigenous liaisons, elders, knowledge keepers, Indigenous navigators, and advocates. And then as we come to the discharge part of the appointment, really making sure to focus on strengths and natural supports in community, ensuring the patient is ready and they feel confident and safe. Also providing a really detailed written plan with resources for the patient, and not rushing, making sure they always know they can come back, and making sure they're prepared for the next steps in their care. So now that we understand kind of those challenges, we can talk a little bit more about what we can do differently in our practice. And that brings us to part 3. I know that part 2 is a little difficult to hear, but it was important to kind of understand where to go from there. So the next question is, what can we do differently in our roles as healthcare providers? So we're going to look at a few key approaches: trauma-informed care, cultural humility, holistic approaches to health, and examples of integrated care within primary care.
Yes, so going over trauma-informed care, we look at the experiences just discussed. That includes bias, mistrust, and harm. It becomes clear that how we provide care matters just as much as what care we provide. One key approach that helps guide this is trauma-informed care. Many Indigenous patients carry layers of trauma: historical, intergenerational, systemic, and personal. Trauma can impact trust, communication, and engagement with healthcare. Trauma-informed care means recognizing that a patient may be living in constant survival mode. It's not about being softer, it's about making care safer. Trauma also shapes responses to care. If a patient refuses an exam, misses an appointment, avoids eye contact, cracks jokes, or seems angry or non-compliant, They may be protecting themselves in a space that has harmed them before. These behaviors are often self-protection, not defiance. Ask yourself, what might this person have experienced? If trauma-informed care is about creating safety, the next step is understanding how we do that in a culturally meaningful way. Beth will now go over the 5 R's, which will give us a practical framework to guide that.
So these are the 5 R's of cultural humility and can help make appointments safer for your patients. So reflection, what did I learn from this person's story, perspective, or response? So this might include learning about lived experience, barriers within healthcare system, communication preferences, or your own emotional reactions. So reflection strengthens curiosity and helps us move away from assumptions towards relational learning. Respect. So did I create a space where the individual felt heard, believed, and valued? And respect can show up through small moments, like listening, believing of experiences, racism, or trauma, and honoring identity, family roles, and cultural practices. Small actions like correct pronunciation, allowing storytelling, or supporting traditional healing can also help. Language and tone can convey microaggressions, and how we speak to and about our patients matters. It can show up in our decisions and care plans. And regard, so did unconscious bias influence my interpretation, tone, or decision making? So this is not about guilt, it's about growth. So notice how bias or system norms may shape our responses. In Indigenous care, this includes recognizing stereotypes, deficit thinking, or power imbalances, and awareness allows us to pause and respond with curiosity rather than judgment. And then relevance. So cultural humility is relevant wherever history, identity, and power influence care. So this might include recognizing power dynamics, responding to historical mistrust, adapting communication, or incorporating culturally meaningful supports. It's also about offering choices. So the patient is in control. So self-determination. Going back to UNDRIP, Indigenous peoples have the right to make decisions about their own health and well-being, including culturally safe care and control over their treatment planning. Understanding a patient's context, like access to transportation, connection to community, or past healthcare experiences, helps us provide care that actually works. And then last one is resiliency. So this shifts the focus from deficits to strengths. Indigenous patients bring resilience through culture, family, and community, and our role is to support and build on those strengths, not just focus on challenges or what's wrong. So the 5 R's, they help us move from task-focused care to relationship-based care. And even small actions like listening, explaining clearly, and offering choice can make care safer and more meaningful. And Veronica is going to chat a little bit more about how to approach the one-on-one patient interactions.
Yes, so a couple questions to help with these interactions. How do I ask my patient about their traditional wellness and cultural supports? So how do I know if my patient is Indigenous? How do I know when to offer traditional wellness supports to a patient? Every provider has a spiel that they open with when meeting with a new patient. In your regular intro, we all go through confidentiality and expectations, etc. I would suggest working that into your spiel. Here are some examples that you can use. We try to make sure our care is culturally safe. Are there any cultural or traditional practices that are important to you that you'd like us to support with? This lets the patient share as much or as little as they want. What benefit plan are you accessing? NIHB keeps a question about resources, not identity labels. Explain why you're asking to offer culturally appropriate care and resources. Make it optional. Give them a chance to decline without pressure. If you don't feel comfortable speaking to what Indigenous supports are available, reach out to one of the PCN Indigenous liaisons. In the next slide, Beth will be covering holistic approaches to care.
Once we've created that space for patients to share what matters to them, the next step is how we respond. So this is where more holistic approach to health becomes important, and how we move from understanding holistic health to actually applying it in our day-to-day work with patients. And when we say that healing is holistic, we're talking about supporting the whole person, not just physical symptoms. So mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being as well. So for many Indigenous patients, these are all interconnected and equally important. This can include cultural practices like smudging, ceremony, connecting with elders, or land-based healing. So these aren't separate from healthcare. They're part of how many people understand healing. So healing isn't just a transaction between provider and patient. It's relational. So when we include family, community, and culture in care planning, we strengthen not only the individual, but the web of relationships that keep them well. Food is also a form of medicine. It's not just nutrition, it's connection to culture, land, and identity. So when we talk about food, we're talking about well-being in a broader sense. Remembering that nutrition isn't just about calories or grams of protein, it's about access to history and culture. So just suggesting to eat more vegetables isn't enough if there's no grocery store within 200 kilometers of their home, or if the food advice ignores cultural preferences. So food is medicine, but only if people have access to it, and only if we respect the relationship they have with it. In practice, our role isn't to be experts in traditional healing, it's just to create space for it. So if a patient is managing chronic pain, they might be using medication or physiotherapy, but also traditional medicines or guidance from an elder. So supporting both can lead to better engagement and outcomes. And ultimately, this approach is creating cultural safety, respect, and trust, and meeting patients where they're at, and recognizing that healing can look different for everyone. So next, we'll be moving on to some examples of integrated Indigenous and Western models of care in Canada and how those relate to primary care here.
Yes, just going over some examples. The Southwest Ontario Aboriginal Health Access Centers are one of the strongest examples in Canada of what integrated Indigenous primary care can look like. Services are provided to Indigenous peoples that include First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, people living on and off reserve, in rural areas, and in the urban Indigenous communities in London, Owen Sound, Newbury, Waterloo, Wellington, and Windsor. These centers are actually governed by Indigenous communities. It's a community-led model designed specifically for Indigenous patients, but the structure itself will feel familiar. It's still primary care, still team-based, still focused on ongoing relationships. What's different is who is included in that team. Alongside physicians, nurses, and mental health providers, you also have elders, traditional healers, and cultural supports working together as part of the care team, not as an add-on, but as an integrated part of the care. The approach is holistic, meaning care supports physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. One of the key ideas is culture as treatment, recognizing that connection to culture, ceremony, and community is part of healing. Patients can access both Western medical care and traditional healing at the same time, depending on what they need. It's not either, and it's not both. What's important for us is that this model shows that integration is possible within primary care. It helps build trust, improves engagement, and leads to better outcomes, especially for patients with complex needs. So while this model is specific to Ontario, it gives us a really practical example of what culturally safe integrated care can look like in action.
Okay. So the First Nations Health Authority is another great example of what system level change can look like in Canada. So it was established in British Columbia in 2013 when First Nations communities took over responsibility of their own health services from the federal government. So what makes the First Nations Health Authority unique is that it's governed and designed by First Nations themselves. This means that health priorities, programs, and services are shaped by the communities they serve rather than imposed externally. So the First Nations Health Authority works in partnership with the provincial healthcare system. So it's not separate from mainstream care, it's integrated. But what's different is the approach. So there's a strong focus on wellness, prevention, and cultural safety, as well as Indigenous knowledge and traditional healing, recognized as important parts of care. So this model reflects self-determination and action, with communities having control over decisions that impact their health and well-being. The First Nations Health Authority is often seen as one of the strongest examples in Canada of how Indigenous and Western approaches can be brought together in a coordinated and respectful way. So what's important here is that Indigenous leadership is guiding how care is designed and delivered. So for us, we don't really have the same governance structure in Alberta, but there's still a really important takeaway that true integration requires partnership and Indigenous leadership. So it's not just about adding services, it's about sharing decision making and working alongside Indigenous communities.
Going over some examples. So what do these systems level changes look like in practice? Some primary care clinics in BC use a patient medical home guided by Indigenous leadership. The Indigenous Patient Medical Home is a model that builds on what many of you already know as the patient medical home, but expands it to better meet the needs of Indigenous patients. This model uses what's often called two-eyed seeing, bringing together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. So alongside physicians, nurses, and mental health providers, you may also see elders, cultural supports, and traditional healing included as part of the care team. Care is holistic, meaning it considers not just physical health, but also mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. It also emphasizes strong connections to community, culture, and identity as part of healing. The key message here is that we don't necessarily need to build something completely new. We can adapt what we already have. Even small changes in how we engage with patients, build relationships, and incorporate cultural supports can make a big difference in patient experience and outcomes.
Okay. So as we come to the end of our training today, I want to encourage you to make one small commitment to yourself for this year and hold yourself accountable to that. So it could be learning a little bit more about the history of one of the Indigenous communities surrounding Calgary, attending a powwow or a round dance, or following a few Indigenous creators or organizations on social media. So getting involved and staying curious because this is your home and we are all treaty people. I always like to include a quote as well. This one is from the Honorable Murray Sinclair, who is the first Indigenous judge in Manitoba and the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He led one of the most powerful truth-telling efforts in Canadian history, documenting the horrors of residential schools and delivering the 94 calls to action. And he made Canada take a hard look in the mirror. So one of his most famous quotes is, we have described for you a mountain. We have shown you a path to the top, and we call upon you to do the climbing. So that brings us to the end of our cultural safety in practice training. And I want to say thank you for being here and engaging in this work. The conversations aren't always easy, and they ask us to reflect on our practice, our systems, and sometimes our own assumptions. But this work is about being intentional and reflective and willing to keep learning. and we really appreciate your openness and commitment. We have also included a short QR code survey. It'll only take a few minutes, but your feedback really helps us understand what's working, what's meaningful, and how we continue to improve these sessions. So thank you for your time and the work that you do every day. Thanks.